Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
You're tearing me apart!
He's looking at you, kid.
Well, nobody's perfect.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Hello and welcome to Revisiting the Golden Age, a journey through classic Hollywood, brought to you by the Inside the Film Room podcast network. I'm your host, Josh Martin, and welcome back to this show. This is episode 5, so if you've enjoyed the show so far, glad you're back for another episode. And today I'm very excited to welcome my good friend, Jordan Snyder, to the show. Jordan, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of Inside the Film Room, and I love your podcast.
Thank you. No, I'm glad to have you on and excited to talk about today's movie. So today we are jumping into the first animated movie of the show so far, and that is Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first feature-length animated film of the classic Hollywood period. The film comes out in 1937, and it is sort of this groundbreaking revolution in animation of nobody had made a feature-length film before. And so this was, I think, my first time watching it. I have no memory from when I was a kid of watching it. Yeah, you sent me a picture before we hopped on the show of, so you don't remember watching it, but you were dopey for Halloween at one point?
Exactly, so that's my only connection to the film, is that surely it must have been before my eyeballs at something for me to have, unless I was just thrust into that costume. But yeah, so that is the only memory I have, is an old photograph of me sporting the dopey duds.
Nice. Yeah, no, I mean, so I was a big, I think Toy Story was my movie of choice as a kid. Yep. And so I have very little memory of most of the sort of classic Disney films that were made in the 30s and 40s. So anytime I've really watched many of them, I know I watched Jungle Book when I was a kid, and I know I watched Dumbo. I don't remember why I remember those two in particular. But a lot of them I have no memory of. So going through some of them now, it's always interesting to imagine how I would have responded to them as a kid versus how I respond now.
Right.
So yeah, I was curious to know what your reaction to this film was and what you thought about it, and because for both of us, this was pretty much our first time, so I was curious.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the same boat that you are, where even the 90s era Disney stuff is a huge blind spot for me. Just the whole Disney filmography was. I'm sure that my parents made me watch some of them growing up, but like you said, I don't really have any memory of those films. And if you had asked me, I couldn't have really placed which one comes where in the chronology of the release of these films. But so watching this one for the first time, it is really interesting to see, okay, there is like a big leap in terms of animation style from the 37 to today, and the 90s. There's a big leap there. But I think, honestly, this is the type of film where I was more interested watching like a behind the scenes about it rather than actually watching the film itself, because the story behind it is, I think, much more fascinating and more substantive than what we actually get in the film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very interesting sort of story and behind the scenes stuff, but you're right. The film itself, though it features certainly no shortage of just utterly gorgeous compositions and drawings and images. What a strange movie to launch sort of the biggest company of all time.
I know.
it really is like it is very thinly drawn together. It is sort of like it starts
It's barely a story, really.
oh, it really is. I mean, I mean, I'm assuming most listeners are familiar with the Snow White tale, or even specifically the Disney version. But to give a sort of, I guess, recap of the plot, there's an evil queen. She has a magic mirror. She wants to be the fairest of them all, yet she is not. She is not. Snow White is. She really wants Snow White dead, and she sends a huntsman, which having not really remembered the story, all I remembered from that was, oh yeah, there was that Kristen Stewart and Chris Hemsworth movie that came out years ago, and that was awful.
You know what's funny about that specifically is that when I was watching it, I was like, after he tells Snow White to run off and then he has to go kill a pig and get the heart, there actually is sort of maybe an interesting story there that's missing. But then I think live action Disney sort of crushed that idea.
Yeah. No, it was it's this sort of brief interlude. Prince Charming shows up at the beginning and is gone for 95% of the narrative. He is barely a character. And then Snow White goes off into the woods, which is like a shockingly horrifying sequence.
Yeah,
considering that I've read that in different places, but I was still taken aback by the fact that this is a genuinely frightening and horrifying movie at times, and I was delighted by that, but also surprised by it. Snow White goes to the woods, and she finds the cabin of the dwarves, and they hang out there for like 40 minutes of the movie, and then eventually the queen turns into an evil witch, and she goes and I don't know. There's more plot. I mean, I could explain the rest. This podcast is spoiler free, so I don't know. Poison apple, true love's first kiss.
Yeah,
you know the rest. But yeah, I was surprised genuinely. It's an 83-minute movie, and it's a really, since it's talked about so much as the first feature-length movie, or feature-length animated movie. Its duration almost seems to be entirely the point. Like there isn't that much story here to sort of carry things forward, and so the film is almost like drawing things out as almost like a show reel. It feels like, of like, here's all the wonderful things we can do with this animation and with these images.
It's a proof of concept.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I don't know a whole ton about the background information of it, but from what I understand, it was a huge gamble for Walt Disney.
Disney's folly, they referred to it as.
Yeah, so it's just he basically pushed all of his money into this project, thinking it would make him and it would be the success. I was wondering the whole time I was watching it, I was like, what in particular, and I don't really have an answer to this, it's more of an open question, and for anybody who listens and knows the answer, I wonder what drew him to this particular story, because I think, as we've discussed so far, there's really nothing like terribly remarkable about it. I mean, it's like very few of the characters are super fleshed out. I do love the dwarves. They're wonderful. But yeah, I was wondering that the whole time, but certainly no shortage of spectacle on display, and a lot of sort of leftovers or sort of lingering homages and effects to both silent comedy and then the early sound film comedy era.
Yeah, and I think actually that Disney had had a book of fairy tales growing up, Grimm fairy tales, and also in one of the behind the scenes things I was watching, had watched one of the earlier silent film versions of Snow White. And I think that's, I don't know what about it just got its hooks in him, but for some reason it did when he saw it. And there's also stories of him telling all the animators to go to lunch, and when you come back, I've got this great idea for you. And he recounts the entire story to them, and he's playing all the characters, and they all just like fell in line with his vision. That I agree with you. I don't know what exactly it was about the story that just inspired that in him, but here we are now.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's I do think that we've talked about the fact that it's a somewhat bare bones narrative and sort of lighter on plot than you would expect, almost to the point of being like non-narrative at times, where there's long stretches in which really nothing of conventional like dramatic intrigue is happening. And I almost wonder if that was, part of the appeal of, it is this sort of foundational fairy tale, like you mentioned, the sort of the Grimm fairy tales and previous versions, and we get from it this sort of simple narrative that allows for a lot of sort of technical innovations to sort of take the center stage and the spectacle of it all, whether it's sort of the multi-plane animation structure that sort of there's a depth of field and things that are happening that it's still eye-popping today. I mean, and there's a lot of beautiful images. I've watched this and I watched Pinocchio, I think a couple months ago, and both films, especially in their sort of the restored Disney Blu-ray editions, they're still utterly marvelous to look at, especially with Disney and animation style more generally these days looking more and more sort of homogenous and bland.
Yeah, I think from a technical standpoint that you can't really understate how, for as slight as the story is, you can't really understate how impactful technologically and from a just animation standpoint the film is. And that's what I got the most enjoyment out of as I was watching it, and just noticing how of course it looks dated, but like the human movements that they did have sort of like a very naturalistic and realistic movement to them that I feel like they sort of shied away with that. In fact, like one of the reasons why the Prince character is cut down so much is just because they couldn't animate it. They had more scenes, a whole storyline like concepted and storyboarded that they just couldn't get animated. So I think, yeah.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because I think that first we get that, what is the musical number at the beginning with the Prince. And yeah, there is something deeply uncanny about how the sort of this, like, he looks like human but not quite, and it's just strange. And I totally understand that, because it is why they had to cut that, because it is sort of something that takes you out of the movie for sure. And they get Snow White mostly right, but there still is this sort of prototypical faces that you're seeing throughout the early Disney movies. Like Snow White's face looks very similar to the fairy godmother's face in Pinocchio. And yeah, so it's this sort of interesting to know and sort of implicitly know, but also I didn't know that for sure, so I was glad you brought it up, because to sort of see it and go like, yeah, something just doesn't look quite right here. The more fantastical they go, the more successful they are. And I think that's actually sort of probably a lesson that was carried over, whether it was future films that focused more on animals, or even Pinocchio, where there's sort of an additional layer of, like, it's not quite supposed to take place in a recognizable reality there.
Right.
So yeah.
And I think that's why the dwarf animations and the woodland creatures and the witch that we get are all more effective than I think the human characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the dwarves are sort of a marvelous feat of animation, and yeah, no, I think and they all sort of come alive as these sort of incredible characters. And I can never remember the names of all seven dwarves. I don't think I will ever be able to, but they are a sort of wonderful character set. I do think this is like, I kind of always get a little sort of I don't know if I've always seen the use in like going back and looking at old Disney films and going like, yes, this is a bit like culturally dated or problematic. Right. But for me with this film, it was like almost a little impossible not to. Especially the romance itself is a bit dicey. I mean, almost on the level of like the fact that there's like no real character development for either of them. And then, like, even though they're the most endearing characters in the film, the dwarves, you can kind of like, I don't know, there's something a little bit there that rubs me the wrong way if you look at it in the context of, um, it's meant to be a fairy tale, so you go, yeah, I'm sure Disney had sort of a write off. But if we're thinking in the context of sort of representations of differently abled people in early Hollywood. Jake Lawler came on the podcast a few weeks ago to talk about Todd Browning's Freaks, and that was a conversation we had of sort of the progressive elements in that film and sort of the more a few elements that still stick out today as problematic. Here, I love the dwarves. Snow White totally infantilizes them throughout, and it's impossible not to cringe at a little bit. But at the same time, I'm like, I love Dopey and I love Grumpy and all of the characters. So it is this strange mix between sort of recognizing the limitations and the sort of joys of what's on display, which is always something fun with these early films.
And Grumpy is one of the cinema's first on-screen woman haters, which I think might become kind of crucial in Disney films to come. That's something that they'll go back to that well several times throughout.
No, it's he is not a fan of people coming into his house and interfering in his space, and it's definitely an interesting character. And Snow White herself, I didn't realize this until I was watching it, mostly because I really hadn't seen it before, but she's like the original manic pixie dream girl. It's like she just like hangs out in the woods and talks to animals and does really nothing else. Well, she takes care of the dwarves and she like cooks and cleans and keeps the house all nice. And so, yeah, I mean, it's definitely any of the older Disney films are going to end up, you look at it and you go, they would not make this film today because it would be, just totally retrograde. But at the time you go, okay, all right, that's
another example of the whole revolution of the technical side and just completely regressive or of the past and from a content standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. It's and that goes to the sort of general point I think we've been getting at this whole time of it's a film where the story feels deeply secondary to everything else that's going on. Like you said, something of a show reel. It is meant to be this sort of spectacle of images that we consume. You could even, this probably would not be a great application of the concept, but I was thinking of, there's like a famous essay by a scholar named Tom Gunning on the cinema of attractions. And this feels like really an attraction of what Disney can do, to the point that there's a few sort of great conventionally like narrative driven sequences. You get that sort of the witch comes to the house near the end of the film, and she's trying to give Snow White the apple, and and the woodland creatures just like intuitively know that she's there to cause trouble, and they go get the dwarves, and then there's all this cross-cutting between the two locations, and that's probably the most conventionally thrilling moment in the film. Much of the rest of it is a little dry, but everything ends rather. I was watching it with my mom and she warned me. She was like, yeah, this ends like really abruptly, so be ready. And I was like, oh, okay. It really does. It goes, the witch falls off a cliff, and then a boulder falls on her as she falls off.
Really epic death, though, I must say.
Oh, absolutely. It is a great death.
Like, that's one of the things, like the darkness in this film for a kid's film, for their first feature effort, like really, really ballsy in that department. Those are probably my favorite segments from the film, that initial Snow White running through the forest sequence, which just has like these great haunting visuals of trees turning into these arms trying to grab her, very like 60s Scooby-Doo-esque visuals in the 30s. So I do have to hand it to the film for those moments of darkness that I just really enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that scene in the forest you're talking about, you're right. It almost has this like expressionistic quality, but also in like a surreal sensibility, and also this sort of fusion of like pop art and just the general sort of terror of it all. And like Snow White's like screaming the whole time. And yeah, I mean, kids probably thought this was like totally normal back in the day. I mean, I'm sure some of them were traumatized, but I have certainly been. I mean, because no kids movie these days gets even like anything less than a PG rating. It seems like, and watching stuff from like back in the day that was just released in theaters and like G rating, totally fine. It's like even stuff in the '90s, like The Lion King. That shit is scary sometimes. That is like really. I think I watched that when I came back and saw it when I was 13, and it is like there are some moments of genuine terror and violence in that movie. And today that would probably be like they'd either have to cut stuff or tone things down to get it to a PG. But back in the day it was like, it's fine, G, put it in theaters. And it's
what was
like,
the live action remake rated?
That was PG. Yeah, I think. Yeah. And then the live action Mulan was PG-13, but that's partially because they like turned that into a wuxia film from what I understand. I have not seen it because I'm not paying $30 for it, but yeah, no. So back to the film itself, it definitely, the moments of some of the most striking moments are either the ones of pure terror or ones that sort of, for me at least, were the ones that sort of basked in the beauty of the scene. I love any of the scenes where the dwarves, they work in a gem mine, and all the shots in the mine are just eye-poppingly gorgeous, and them walking back and forth, and there's these beautiful sunsets. And it really is a film that I think any audience member over a certain age will probably find themselves, at least by the narrative itself, fairly bored. At least I was. I wasn't like overly invested in the story, but as like a pure aesthetic appreciation, I was able to get a lot out of it. And I also liked the, especially because on the first episode of the show, me and our friend Jesse, we talked about Duck Soup, the Marx Brothers film. And there's like explicit homages to, like, Dopey is absolutely Harpo Marx. Like, it's just like, he is like, that is that character translated into a Disney film, the sort of same silent pantomime comedy. And Dopey's like probably my favorite part of the film. And so I enjoyed a lot of that, and some of the musical sequences where things are being sort of coordinated, and you've got like clocks on the wall going off, or little like the animals, and so there's a certain sense of joy, and how did they pull that off back in the day when this technology was still sort of in its infancy. That's really remarkable, while at the same time you're going, wow, absolutely nothing has happened to this movie. It's been 45 minutes.
And one of the things that I noticed is that they had specific scene directors, and it definitely feels like that just because each scene sort of feels like its own distinct, separate piece from the film. And that just goes back more to the proof of concept thing where they're just trying stuff out just to see what'll work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the credited director on Letterboxd or IMDb is David Hand, but you're right. There's a ton of different sort of figures who are working on this film in coordination, all sort of under the vision of Walt Disney. And when I was looking at the credits, and the credits are long because a ton of people had to work on this to pull it off, and I'm sure many more people back in the period in which we had shorter credit sequences. I'm sure there's many more people who didn't fully get credit who probably deserved it. But the one thing I noticed, and this was the wildest statistic to me, the names of what screenwriters and sort of people who work on adaptations, that sort of terminology over who's responsible for dialogue and who's responsible for the story has changed a lot over the history of Hollywood. Sometimes you'll look back at films made in the 30s and 40s and it'll be like story by, adapted by, dialogue by. And so it's hard to tell, and this may be, someone may have a really good explanation for this, but there are 8 people credited in the category of story adaptation. And I was just, while I watched the rest of the film, I was just thinking, what was adapted? I mean, like there couldn't have been that much like substantial I mean, there's a few plot points, but that was a remarkable. I was like, oh wow, okay.
Yeah. And tons of stuff was left on the cutting room floor, like whole scenes that never made it into the film, in addition to like the whole Prince storyline, and all, I think, under the guise of if they couldn't actually get the job done, then they would say it was because it wasn't in service to the story, which I feel like if that was their standard, then a lot more of the footage would have been cut. But I'll go with them on that like they had a lunchtime musical piece where it doesn't have, it's just a fun little song. It doesn't actually add anything. And although I would make the case that you can say that about some of the other songs, but to each their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, since you've watched some of the sort of documentaries and material on the making of this film, when stuff was sort of left on the cutting room floor, in what stage of do you know in what stage of progress that had gotten? Like, were there like fully completed scenes that they just decided to excise at the last minute? Or was it stuff that early in the sort of conceptual stage, they went, okay, yeah, we probably don't need this?
I'm not sure at what stage some of them. I think it was various issues. Like one is like the Prince, where they just couldn't get it done in time because it was just that difficult for them to animate. And then others, it was those for this Prince, for instance. I think there was only like a few storyboards here and there. Some of the other scenes weren't, I don't think they were inked and colored yet, but they had storyboards and a basic sound mix to them. Walt Disney, I believe, had a show in the 50s where he revealed one of the cut sequences. So it was various stages of the process, and I imagine most of them were out of necessity.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I was just wondering, I would feel, because especially in a time when, you know, hand-drawn animation has always taken a lot of time and still does, but, you know, especially when you're like working on stuff for the first time, I would be so mad if I was one of those animators and something got left on the cutting room floor that we'd spent like 4 months working on. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that the notion of everything must work in service of the story is, you know, you hear that a lot in movies, and it's kind of a silly notion. I mean, you know, it's strange watching this movie and going, there's really not a lot here. I mean, this movie could be like a short if they had really wanted it to be. But it's a very sort of bizarre thing, but at the same time, like I sometimes find narrative downtime and this sort of looser structure that this film has more rewarding. And I think it does sort of connect with the fact that this is sort of the first example of the form. But at the same time, it is interesting to compare it to the second Disney animated film and the third, technically. I haven't actually seen Fantasia, but I know roughly what it is, which seems more in line with a series of different scenes and stuff that's loosely interconnected. But Pinocchio was like very plot driven, and that was the second one that came out. And it's interesting to put in contrast to this film that is so loose in comparison, so relatively thin from a character development standpoint. You know, barely anybody really has an arc. I mean, the Snow White is the same at the beginning as she is at the end, except there's a prince now. I guess the dwarves, most of them stay the same, but you know, Grumpy gets a little less grumpy. The witch never learns, she dies. Whereas like Pinocchio has like very specific and sort of interesting arcs. And it's interesting to see Disney experimenting with, you know, to what extent narrative form should take place here, to what extent are these films that are, you know, mostly designed for children, although I'm sure that was not the only target audience in mind, especially in these early days, to what extent they can sort of be non-narrative or very sort of narratively minimalistic. And intertitles do a lot of work here. Like a lot of the heavy lifting is done by, you know, they're like all of a sudden it's like Snow White takes a bite of the apple and she like passes out. And then all of a sudden it cuts to, okay, and now here's what happened in the next 5 scenes. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see the limitations and the possibilities of this sort of early mode.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like it's funny that we are both kind of harping on it a lot for just being sort of boring and slight, but at the same time, just how, like, seeing it at the time, surely it would have been amazing because it blew up. It was extremely successful, and people like didn't think it would be. They thought it would hurt people's eyes too much, the bright colors of the animation. They thought people would get tired of the type of gags that comes with cartoon animations. And so the fact that it was as successful as it was, I think says a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I don't know if I would personally describe it as boring so much. It is just like, I do agree, surprisingly slight is perhaps, I agree with that.
Yeah, that's a better way to describe it, yeah.
Yeah, I think, because, like, I mean, I can certainly see someone watching it and going, yeah, this is pretty boring, because a good chunk of it, you get all of the narrative in the first 10 and last 10 minutes, and then much of the rest is pretty light on plot. And so, I mean, that sort of goes along with some, like, research interests I've done before in terms of the sort of relative, like, narrative minimalism of certain films. Here it's more striking in the context of its sort of historical placement as this central film in the Disney canon, and this sort of origin point for the entire style and the animation industry in general. It's just interesting that it was sort of this very basic fairy tale, that today would certainly appear regressive in some ways. And every sort of Snow White, I was talking with, I think I was talking with my mom about, like, why haven't they haven't gone back to this well. They've remade everything under the sun. They will remake every movie. But they haven't really gone back to the Snow White well, at least not that I can really recall.
Oh, you've jinxed
the closest. I know I have. But, if they're going to remake things, I'd like to see them try to get The Witch in a remake. That would be fun.
Yeah,
see if
I
you
wouldn't
can do
hate
that without a PG-13 or something like that. But the closest to me that they've done in terms of going back to this sort of foundational Disney text, and it is a film that, from what I understand, Disney aficionados are very protective over. I for someone who didn't necessarily grow up with all the Disney films, I remember some of the 90s ones very well. Actually, Beauty and the Beast, I watched a ton of times in school, Aladdin. But for someone who doesn't remember the early ones, I did, like, go to Disney a lot as a kid. Like, Disney World in Florida was, like, a frequent vacation spot. I haven't been in years, but there was a Snow White ride, and when that closed down, it was like uproar season with Disney fans. But for me, the closest they've come back to going into this territory is Enchanted, the Amy Adams film from, gosh, what was it, 2007 now? That's the closest to me. And that one is satirical and a parody in nature, because in reality, just simply the culture has evolved past, like, that's like a tweet format, but the culture has evolved past the need for really simplistic fairy tales that sort of don't really offer much insight and value. Not that this film doesn't still have its pleasures and its cultural values, but I think there's a reason that the only Snow White takes we've seen have been deeply revisionist in nature.
Yeah, and honestly, I was thinking with my 2020 brain when I was watching the ending of this film, sort of, and I don't know why even I was very naive to think this, but that Prince character that you mentioned disappeared for 95%. I was thinking that this True Love's Kiss was going to be related to the dwarfs in some way. It was stupid of me to think that, but the prince does come back after he's been gone the entire duration of the movie, and he plants one on her, and that's what does it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was something I was thinking about and talking about while I was watching the movie, is that, she's formed this connection with the dwarves throughout this whole movie, but, and this goes back to the sort of regressive politics, both from a gender perspective and the question of disability, but simply because they're differently abled. I mean, she calls them, I think, like, little men at different points. Previous to that, when she goes in the house, it's like, oh, it's a house full of children. Yeah. And it's like, oh, some of it's really cringy. But, and yeah, the prince, who does not have a name, who has no depth, comes back and kisses her, and she wakes up, and off they go.
And we're supposed to have some sort of emotional reaction to that.
Yeah. And so certainly you watch any of that today and you go, huh, all right.
Yeah.
But, it certainly, I think, as we've talked about, it's a film to engage with on almost purely aesthetic grounds, in terms of the spectacle of its images and its sort of pleasures on a purely visual level, while also discounting the fact that its narrative is both sort of incredibly retrograde and not all that interesting at times. Though for me, its downtime is potentially rewarding in its own strange way.
Right. And for better or for worse, who can say what would have happened? But if it wasn't a success, Disney likely would not be the entity that we know it as today.
Yeah.
So
maybe could have been a good thing in some way.
Exactly. That's the thing to think about. Like, what are we missing from that, and what might be better about 2020 minus Disney?
A world without Disney. Interesting. Yeah, no. So certainly a foundational film in film history, and I was glad I watched it. And it's interesting and fascinating and very strange and scary and regressive and all kinds of things. It's a fun film to talk about. Well, Jordan, thanks for coming on. So if viewers want to hear more from, I know you've guested on a bunch of different podcasts before. I assume they follow you on Twitter, check out some of your other appearances. Anything you want to plug?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter. It's Jordy Sny, JORDYSNY. And yeah, anytime I'm on any other podcast, I'll tweet about it there. So you can follow me there.
Awesome. Sounds good. So follow Jordan on Twitter, and Jordan will be back. We've got lots more episodes as we move to the 40s and 50s and 60s in the next few months. And so looking forward to those future conversations. And so you can follow me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Martin on Movies. Check out my work at Film Inquiry, at Inside the Film Room, and at Aspect, UNC's new journal of film and media studies for undergraduate students. All of that information is on my Twitter page. You can follow Inside the Film Room on Twitter as well. If you've liked this podcast so far, feel free to leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And so, thank you again to Jordan for coming on. This was a really fun conversation. And more podcasts coming soon. We've got everything from international films like The Rules of the Game and Grand Illusion to Trouble in Paradise. I've been teasing that one for a while, but it is coming soon. So lots more fun podcasts to come. So thank you for joining us for this episode, and I'll see you next time.